It has been 32 months since the attack on the U.S. Capitol that disrupted a joint session of the U.S. Congress in the process of completing the presidential election results. More than 1,100 defendants have been charged in nearly all 50 states and the District of Columbia. More than 110 individuals have been found guilty of felonies. Kyle Cheney of Politico has spent a lot of time during these past months covering the trial in the U.S. District Court of the District of Columbia. We asked him to give us an overview of what these court proceedings have looked like up close. Kyle Cheney, what would you say to somebody that asks you, what's it like to cover the D.C. District Court about the January 6th events?
There's no such thing as covering the January 6th events because there's so much to actually cover. There's no way to do it all. In fact, there's so many dozens of cases pending all at the same time that some of them go completely uncovered, and there's probably important and newsworthy information in them. But we sort of, again, when you're charging more than 1,000 people in a 2-year span, 2.5 years now, and then maybe 1,000 more to come, you have to sort of pick your spots, and we have informed ways of doing that. But this story is just sprawling and important, and to really get into it. There's no way to get fully into it, but you can cover maybe the most important aspects.
When did you start covering this story?
On January 6th, and in fact, before in a strange way, because I had been covering a lot of Trump-related investigations, which morphed into covering his effort to try to stay in power through the courts and what ultimately became through Congress, and I'd been eyeing that with some wariness about the potential for violence. There was some fear on Capitol Hill. I was a congressional reporter specifically, and when the violence happened, when the riot broke out at the Capitol, I knew that was going to become the story that I covered from that point on. Again, because we'd covered the buildup and the march to that point, and some of the processes that preceded it, and so then it became all-consuming, trying to understand how he had gotten there and the two levels of this thing. I think you're familiar with this. There's the level of what happened in the White House. There's and at that level, and then there's the level of what happened on the ground on January 6th with the violence and how those two connected.
So, what is Politico?
So, Politico, where I've worked for the last 11 and a half years, and it's we cover everything in Washington. We really cover the power centers of in America. We try to cover the way power is exercised by the branches, by the White House, by Congress, and I guess in political campaigns too, and how the exercise of that power changes over time, how the parties sort of jockey for control. And so I think historically, Politico has kind of been stereotyped as a horse race coverage kind of place. I think maybe when it started, it was more like that, very quick sort of sugar rush type stories about raw politics, and I think it's become much more complex than that. We cover policy just as aggressively as we cover politics now. We cover the courts. I work as part of a legal team that covers explicitly not just the D.C. court, but all the courts in the Supreme Court. And so we try to hit everything and the way the power is exercised through those institutions.
Does the public at large have access to Politico?
They do. We're available, Politico.com. I'm a frequent Twitter user and try to share everything we can. I guess it's X now. Share everything we can that way and blast out as much as we can. But it's all available. We do have a subscriber component, Politico Pro, that really drills very deep into the policy weeds. And I actually started on that team. I was a healthcare reporter for a long time. And we have tech and trade and things that are subscriber based, and a lot of people on Capitol Hill, for example, subscribe because they're interested in really detailed.
Describe what it's like inside one of these courtrooms during these trials.
Sure. So there's the high-profile trials, like the one, for example, the Proud Boys, where leaders of essentially on the ground on January 6th that got a lot of coverage. Dozens of reporters checked in on that, at least for part of it, if not all of it. And then there's the ones that nobody sees. As I mentioned, there are a lot of things that don't get covered, and you can walk into a courtroom where a really important proceeding's happening and find nobody in there. And it's always remarkable the kind of news that gets made in these courtrooms when potentially no one's watching. I think it's because you have about 20 judges, and at any given time you have 20 different proceedings, and there just aren't that many reporters to cover them all. But they're like little snapshots or snippets of January 6th, and sometimes you get powerful testimony from police officers who suffered that day, from people who witnessed it, from the defendants themselves. A lot of them have actually taken the stand and talked about why they did what they did, and there's really interesting almost vignettes about individual people and how they ended up where they did and why, that paint a fuller picture when you put them together.
In a recent sentencing procedure, Officer Cooley from the Capitol Hill Police came in and said her thing about what happened on January the 6th. What was that all about?
Sure. Actually, her name is Shay Cooney.
Cooney, okay.
Cooney, and she was one of the officers who was at the front line as the mob on January 6th approached the Capitol. And they included a couple of leaders of the Proud Boys, as I mentioned, and she essentially was not quite face-to-face with them, but just off to the side, and witnessed a couple of those Proud Boys leaders dismantle a fence. And now that one act alone didn't cause the riot, but it was an important part of the mob reaching the foot of the building. And she witnessed that, and she talked about, that's a very technical component. She talked about much more visceral things that she witnessed. She saw her fellow officers in severe pain, getting attacked, getting overrun by this mob. People she saw blood, and she saw people getting sick. The smell of the chemical sprays that were being launched in both directions was just overpowering. And I think hearing her speak about it was powerful because she said, and when she talked about that, she'd never talked about it before, and she broke down. A lot of the times these officers try to maintain their composure and try to keep it professional, and she couldn't, and that was really powerful to hear.
At the end of all this, when they're about to be sentenced, what impact do you think that has on a judge?
I think it means a lot. I think a lot of these judges, at this point, 2.5 years later, they have heard so much of this that their ideas and their impressions of January 6th are fairly set. And in fact, I'd be surprised if judges haven't heard several times from some of these same officers, or different sets of officers who similarly suffered that day, or saw their colleagues suffered, or their friends and families of their colleagues, or their own. And so I think that the judges have a pretty clear idea of the horrors of that day, and I think when you see a lot of outside forces try to downplay what happened, the judges aren't fooled by that because they see this on a daily basis. They see the wreckage that it caused and still causes for a lot of these people that are in their courtrooms.
Do you have any overall impression of the judges?
Sure. I think, there's the outside world's perception of the D.C. courts, and then there's actually being in those rooms and seeing the thoughtfulness that they put, that I would say to a person, these judges apply to every one of these cases. I mean, there's this perception out there that D.C. judges are just, I think maybe because they're in D.C. and D.C. is sort of a left-leaning place, that they're somehow anti-Trump, or just would be reflexively partisan. And I think if anyone watching these proceedings can't come away with that conclusion, because they go through every granular detail of every moment for every one of these defendants, and I haven't seen any judge sort of just reflexively side with the prosecution just because that's where their sympathies lie. They're really careful about what actions that person took that contributed to and January 6th, every aspect of it is on video. It's not these are not whodunit kind of cases. Everything is clear. There may be a question about someone's intent, their complete intent, and what's in their heads when they're there, and that's sort of what the judges grapple with. But what they really did on that day is not a mystery like it is in so many other cases.
So what's it going to be like for Donald Trump if he has to sit in one of those courtrooms next year?
That I couldn't predict, because I think it's going to transform the entire courthouse, because it's going to become locked down kind of a place where there's not going to be a lot of freedom of movement like there usually is, where you can just bounce from one room to the other and check in on some of these cases. I think when Trump is there, it's going to be like, when he was there for his arraignment, it was pretty locked down, high levels of security, Secret Service, and so I think it will feel very different than it normally does. But I think, even seeing him in that brief arraignment that he have to sit in front of a magistrate, not even a confirmed judge, and take orders essentially and do what he's told is very unusual for someone who used to be president of the United States, and not just any president, but a very brash one who's very famously doesn't like to do what he's told. So seeing that on a daily basis, have to sit there and face the same kind of justice that some of these other defendants do for January 6th is going to be extremely powerful.
What will his life be like in that courtroom, and when will he be allowed to speak?
Well, he's very difficult to tell not to speak, even when it might not help his legal interests. So when he can speak may be sort of up to him, but he does have limitations on what he can say. His pretrial release conditions, not just in one case, but in 4 criminal cases, essentially say you can't harass and attack witnesses or the prosecution, and that kind of limits a lot of what he would normally talk about in these cases. And so I think he'll be tempted to weigh in every day of this trial. He'll probably hear testimony that he disagrees with, and normally he'd just take to, Truth Social or Twitter or whatever platform he's using and rail about it. But I think his lawyers might tell him, you do that, we're going to quit because you're going to poison the case. I think one of the things the judge in Washington is very concerned about is poisoning the jury pool, and she's going to be acutely aware of his out-of-court commentary and whether that could affect the ability to put on a fair trial in Washington. And so if his lawyers aren't forcing him to be disciplined, that's going to become a collision at some point.
Try to describe the room that he'll be sitting in, or any of these defendants. What's around them?
There's 2 parts of the courthouse. There's the older side where things are a little bit more dated, and then there's the newer annex, which is where Trump's arraignment was. But I think my anticipation is he'll be in the ceremonial courtroom, which is on the top floor. It's a larger space where you'd want to put a trial that was clearly going to have an enormous public interest. And I think that they're fairly ornate. There's portraits of judges in that room. They're not Trumpy, and they're not gold plated like they would be in sort of one of his estates, but they're ornate in a government sort of way. A lot of wood paneling, wooden sort of pew-like seating for the public. There'll be some TV screens there, both for the witnesses to see evidence and then also to broadcast things throughout the courthouse. And then the question is, whether that room is actually technologically capable enough of broadcasting to other places, where like a media room. That's something the court's personnel are figuring out, because there's such enormous public interest in this trial, but these court proceedings are not televised. So that's going to be a whole other can of worms when it gets closer.
What's the media room like?
Well, for major events, there's usually actually a couple of media rooms. There's a very tiny one that's normally open only for big trials. So like the Proud Boys trial, for example, it was open every day, and you'd sit in this very sort of, it's kind of decrepit a little bit. It used to be an old courtroom that was then cut in half and walled off, and now it's this very tiny and unappealing windowless space that feels like home when you spend enough time in it. But it's just got 2 screens, and essentially on each screen it's sort of divided up into panels where you'd have a different view of the defendants, the judge, and and the prosecution tables and the evidence. And so it's a bit strange to be in the courthouse and not be watching the proceedings live. You're still watching it on a screen, but there's no other way to actually watch these proceedings and then also cover it live.
What do you prefer, in the courtroom or in the media room?
It is always better to be in the courtroom, I think, to really get a sense of what's happening. I think I generally lean toward the media room because there's such an urgency to some of this reporting that when you're in the courtroom, you can't use your devices. You got to turn your phone off. They're very watchful. It's a very old-fashioned mindset. And in the media room, you can at least have your computer out. You can send updates, especially on big cases where there's a lot of competitive coverage. You want to be able to report the news quickly. or you'll hear from your editors about it. So I'll be in the media room and sort of feeding updates as they come.
So what would you say to somebody in the public who says the whole process intimidates me, and can I really get in and watch it?
Absolutely. Trump matters, maybe a different story, but for the everyday, even some of the bigger January 6th related cases, you can. The courtrooms don't fill up. Sometimes when they do, there's overflow rooms where they'll broadcast it into that room. So I always tell people, come to Washington if they're interested in government and politics. You can go to the museums; they're wonderful. You can go to the Capitol, get a tour. I think going to the courthouse, especially as these January 6th proceedings are unfolding, and just catching a glimpse of that is such a eye-opening picture of the way government works, the way the proceedings work, and capture such an important moment in our history that it's also worthwhile if you care about that.
For the general public, if the courtroom is full, do they have any other options?
No, and that's actually
I'm thinking of the overflow rooms.
Oh yeah, yes. I mean, when there's an overflow room, and they are often in major cases, it's another courtroom essentially that's repurposed into a room where you can view the proceedings. They'll put it on the TV screens there, and that's just as, again, nothing's quite as good as being in the room, but it's also a fairly serviceable way to see what's happening, get a sense of it, and see it live. Because again, if you're outside the building, there's no way to see it live. It's just not doable, and so it is, important. I think we try again. We can only report so much. We try to report on everything, but being there and seeing it even on the screens is better than even just seeing the written word sometimes.
So, what do you think of the jury selection process, and how does it work?
That, to me, is one of the most fascinating parts of any of these trials, the jury selection process. It can get tedious sometimes. You see dozens of people sort of circulating in and out of the courtrooms, but each one of them essentially tells their life story, and they get grilled. Well, in bigger cases. In smaller cases, there can be questionnaires and sort of easier ways to thin out the crowd. But on January 6 cases, where there's an element of politics, they like to interview the jurors, and those interviews can be fascinating. And it's just, first of all, you get a snapshot of Washington, because you're seeing all Washington, D.C. residents come in and talk about what do you do, where do you live, what's your background, and then it's always funny, the small world aspect, the sort of fishbowl aspect, because there tend to be a disproportionate number of defense contractors, people who work on Capitol Hill, people who work in government, and NASA, and it's always, and they say, and you'll ask them, oh, do you know this person? They'll say, oh, you know this person involved in the case? And they'll say, oh yeah, I went to, I worked with them for 3 years on the Hill, and then I did, and you always hear those people are not selected for the juries, when there's that kind of relationship, but there's always these bizarre moments of I was a fundraiser on Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, or my dad donates to the Republican Party, and you hear these sort of very Washington type bios, but it's also amazing because there's a lot of people that don't live and breathe government that live in Washington, D.C., and a lot of times those are the people who get picked, because when you're dealing with January 6th and you people who have visceral opinions about it, oftentimes those are the same people that are the ones who work in government, the ones who might work near the Hill or on the Hill, and so they're not eligible essentially. But you hear from school teachers and taxi drivers or Uber drivers, and you hear from everyday people who aren't consumed by it the way the people that I tend to write about are, and it's a reminder, A, that not everyone is as consumed by this as we all are. It's important to remember that, but B, that D.C. is not a monolithic place. And I think that's going to become more an important point as Donald Trump's trial gets closer and they talk about jury selection there.
What's the longest it's taken to get a jury in any of the trials you've been covering?
The Proud Boys, I think, was the longest that I can recall. There were 5 of them charged with seditious conspiracy, and the judge in that case, Tim Kelly, sort of takes things slow in general. Maybe that's the generous way to describe it. It can be very laborious to see his proceedings, but it took more than 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks to seat a jury, and he was very solicitous of the defense objections. And in fact, one of the defendants who was just sentenced before him said, who got 15 years in prison, said, but thank you for your jury selection process. I feel like, I was worried about having a fair trial, and I think my fighting chance was because you helped me get through jury selection in a way that I thought was fair. And I think it's so important how those juries are picked. And the fact that he took 2.5 weeks, maybe it felt painful for us to sit through, but probably resulted in a better process.
Is there ever a time when you can't select a jury because of their prejudices?
I haven't seen it here, and I think the judges return to that point often. Defendants claim it all the time. There's no way we're going to get a fair jury in Washington. And then when you go through that interview process, it becomes very clear, oh, of course you can't. These people, there are these people who aren't consumed by the politics, who aren't going to just throw someone in prison because they don't like their political views. And so I think the judges always go through that process first before they even decide if you can seat a fair jury, because it becomes pretty obvious that you can in pretty much every case. I think in the rare instance where you have a large pool of people and you somehow cannot find 16 who can be fair, then the judge would say maybe we transfer to a different venue. Defendants make venue motion transfers all the time. I haven't seen any single one granted because it never reaches that point. They always can agree on 12 to 16 jurors who can be fair.
How many times can a defense lawyer or a prosecutor dismiss a juror who potentially would serve on the jury before they get there?
So it happens in a couple phases. There's, a pool of, say, 50 or 75 who get called in, and they get interviewed, and then they can strike them for cause, which means that that person displayed obvious bias. So we're all going to agree that person's not going to sit on the jury. And that's a mutual decision of both the defense and the prosecution and the judge. And then once they get through that phase and they found a sort of pool of maybe 30 to 40 jurors who seem like they passed, essentially the test, then there's peremptory strikes where each side, the prosecution and the defense, gets a set number of strikes, and they can say, the defense can say, oh, I didn't like the way that juror answered one of the questions, so I want to strike that person, and they can do that up to the limit that they have. And I think the number varies from case to case. The judges can decide, based on the larger pool they have, how many. Just essentially, they have to whittle it down to 16. So however many they qualify in that larger pool is how many strikes there will be divided up among the parties.
So if you're a defendant, where do you sit in the courtroom, and where does the jury sit, and do they see each other?
They do. And these courtrooms are not huge. They're not cavernous, except for that one I mentioned, the ceremonial courtroom. They're not really cavernous rooms. You see everything, you hear everything. And so it's a especially for a long trial, it's almost an intimate environment where people really get to know each other, because you're in an enclosed space for many hours a day. And with jurors, I think defendants tend to only make eye contact with them. I think there's probably some strategy behind it too that they discuss with their lawyers about making sure you look confident in yourself in front of a jury, and how you carry yourself. I've seen actually a judge admonish a defendant to stop making faces because the jury was going to see it, and that might prejudice you. So I think the rooms are sometimes organized a little bit differently, how they arrange the tables, but it's all close enough that they can see each other and be aware of of facial expressions.
Another question about access. Do you need a pass to get in the building? Do you need a pass to get in the courtroom? Is there a limit on the amount of time you can spend in one of these trials?
No to all three. One of the things I love about the courthouse, even more than the Capitol, is its freedom of access. It's an equalizer. Anybody can get in the same way. You have to wait in the same lines. The only people who get to skip the lines are lawyers and jurors, and of course the judges. But anybody else coming in, defendants usually, members of the press, people coming in for jury selection who aren't yet jurors, and other lawyers, many of the lawyers who aren't don't have DC bar cards, who come from out of state or wherever, they have to all wait in the same line. And once you're in, you're in. You got to, behave properly and act with decorum, or else the marshals will take an issue with you. But otherwise, you can go into any courtroom, watch any proceeding, as long as it's not sealed from public view, which is rare. I've occasionally brought family members in who are just fascinated by some of these issues, and they come in and watch, and they're always amazed that they can get as close as they can to some of the action.
Can you talk to the defendants when they're on trial and in between breaks and all that?
Yeah, the ones who aren't in pretrial detention, who are, in other words, incarcerated prior to their verdict, because they're sort of segregated from the public even when they're in the courthouse. But others who are there, I always find the courthouse cafeteria is this unbelievable slice of DC life where you see defendants who some of you've read about in relation to January 6th or other politically sensitive matters, jurors that come and get lunch, the lawyers, sometimes there are notable defendants. I've seen, the former general counsel of the FBI just sitting there in the cafeteria next to a January 6th defendant who I've been writing about in a completely separate, unrelated matter.
Do the judges ever come to the cafeteria?
Occasionally, yeah. They don't usually sit there and hang out, but I've seen them waiting in the line like everybody else to get their food and coffee. And
general public have access to the cafeteria.
They do. And so it's again, I sort of view it as an equalizer. Kind of everyone is the same there. I mean, the judges certainly get their perks. It's their building, but other than that, it's the same.
How close is the U.S. District Court to the Capitol? Where is it located?
Directly, like sort of diagonally across the street. You can see the Capitol from the cafeteria window, and from some of the courtrooms. Well, the courtrooms don't usually have windows, but there are some offices in the court that do have windows, and you can see the Capitol building. And that's actually a really powerful backdrop to some of these cases. You're talking about people who attacked the Capitol, and you're saying that building is right across the street. I can see the spot where you attacked the Capitol from the courthouse where you're now being tried for your alleged crime. And I think that's created a very powerful imagery and sort of symbolism to a lot of these trials.
What can you tell us about the defense attorneys?
There are a wide variety of them, and there's a lot of federal public defenders who I think have gotten occasionally a bad rap as though they're somehow not, because they're court appointed, they're not going to be as diligent. But in fact, I've seen quite a few of them do a better job defending their clients than some of these retained attorneys who come in with an agenda and maybe more of a media savvy or attempted media savvy approach. But I think so there's the federal public defenders who do a lot of these January 6th cases. There's
Let me stop you there to describe what is a public defender.
Sure.
How do they get assigned to a case?
So when a defendant is deemed unable to afford their own criminal attorney, they have a constitutional right to have a good defense at trial, and so the court will appoint one, and they can either be from the federal public defender's office, or there's another set of attorneys who sort of are on call essentially to represent defendants when they're deemed unable to afford their own. And a lot of them are frequent. They're people who have dozens of these cases, and so you get to know them pretty well and their styles and their personalities, and most of them have good relationships with the prosecutors, have good relationships with the judges because they're here quite often.
During the Proud Boys trial, there was one woman who was a defense attorney by the name of Carmen Hernandez. And you can describe how she went through her job there, but then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, she was no longer Zachary Reel's attorney. I'd like to know what happened with all that. Explain.
Sure.
Carmen Hernandez.
Carmen Hernandez became a sort of mini courthouse celebrity during the Proud Boys trial just because she was notorious for, I guess, picking fights. I mean, she fought every little detail, every little decision that Judge Kelly made in that case, and in probably ways that helped stretch the trial out over the 4.5 months. Maybe a month of that is due to Carmen's arguing with Judge Kelly, and I think she would view it as zealous advocacy, and I think maybe Zach Reel would have too. But I think it became almost a running joke that why is the trial delayed? Oh, Carmen's still fighting over whatever point she's fighting over. I think if I were a defendant, I would be happy to see my lawyer up there fighting the way she was constantly. I don't know if her antagonistic relationship with the judge was necessarily helpful, and maybe I think she at points realized that maybe her own client might not be benefiting if the judge has an animus toward her. But I think she is the way she is, and she's been like that in every case I've ever seen her in, because she views it as important to fight for her client. And she was with Zach Reel, one of the defendants, all the way through the entire trial and beyond. But when it came to sentencing, he decided to switch lawyers to Norm Pattis, who actually represented one of the other Proud Boys in the case. And so Norm represented both of them, Joe Biggs and Zach Reel, at the sentencing. And that's a little bit unusual. They had to waive some conflicts of interest there because, for example, Norm might be incentivized to compare the two of them, their conduct, and say, well, this one's conduct, Zach Reel's conduct was worse than Joe Biggs. Like, under some circumstances, you'd want to compare that to say, well, this guy deserves a lesser sentence because he didn't do as much as the other guy. But you can't do that if you're representing them both, so it was a bit odd. And I don't know if Zach chose to do that because he felt like Carmen's relationship with the judge was too fraught, and that might affect his sentence.
Or he still got 15 years.
He still got 15 years, which, that's an extraordinary sentence, and the judge emphasized that, but it's also less than half of what the government was seeking, or about half of what the government was seeking for him. And so I don't know if that's because of the advocacy or just the judge was never going to give the full 30 years that the government wanted, but, and I'm sure he's not happy with 15. He's got a young daughter, and he's now not going to get to see grow up the way he would if he was home, and I think that came out in court yesterday. But
give us your impression of Norm Pattis, and I asked this for a couple of reasons. One, he represented Alex Jones
yes,
in the case that I think how many billions of dollars was Jones?
Oh gosh, I don't remember the number. It was a big number.
Yeah, from the was Sandy Hook case up in Connecticut. He was in the court and dominant in some ways in his speaking. But you give us the analysis.
Sure, he seemed to have a better rapport with Judge Kelly, but he would wax eloquent quite often about the sort of historical context for January 6th. He'd talk about the founders and the origins of the various political principles behind the free speech principles that they viewed as at the heart of the Proud Boys case. And he would make it, and he would make arguments that that were aimed at the entirety of the case, and say things like, well, if we're too unduly harsh, if we punish these people for speaking their minds and speaking out on social media, even if they went over the line in their speech, we're going to actually worsen the divide in this country, and we're not going to do the justice that we are supposed to be doing in this courtroom. And he'd get very philosophical about that. I don't know how much that played with Judge Kelly. I think they liked each other personally, but I don't know if that necessarily helps either, because that's not a question of law. That's a question of, again, philosophy, politics, things that the courts aren't really supposed to consider.
The other atmospheric, especially in the Proud Boys trial, was the fact that they were incarcerated during the trial. And because of that, they were all dressed up in their coats and ties, and there were about 4 U.S. Marshals sitting around them. What impact does that have on the jury? And does the jury know? Does anybody tell them that they're incarcerated?
Yeah. It was an important dynamic, and the judges think about the optics of that. And I think the best way, at least, and the way they handled it, is to not comment on it at all. And maybe the jurors, who presumably haven't done this very often, aren't aware that it's unusual to have Marshals sitting there right next to the defendants at all times. Where it became more notable was when those defendants took the stand. And they actually had to consider this when the jury was out of the room. How do we do this? Because you have to have a marshal right next to him. That's policy. The marshals have their own policy they have to adhere to. But you don't want it to be so distracting that the jurors say, oh, this guy looks dangerous because he has to have an armed marshal sitting next to him at all times. And so they did it in a weird way with the Proud Boys, at least, where they had a marshal sitting right behind the defendant, but he was behind a dividing wall, so it was just kind of his head poking up over the wall, and it looked a little bit strange. But I think they decided that looked less overbearing or less threatening, essentially, to a jury than having the marshal sitting right next to the defendant while he testified.
Do you have access, or have you had access to the defendants or the defense lawyers or the judge, or for that matter, the prosecutor?
Well, the defendants, as I mentioned, are segregated from the public, so you don't really get access to them. But the lawyers walk around the courthouse like everybody else, and so you do. And the judges similarly do not really usually step out into the hallway, and even when they do, they're not prone to taking questions. And in fact, it'd probably be frowned upon to even press them, although an enterprising reporter could try. In fact, I did get access to one of the Proud Boys, Enrique Tarrio, once during the course of this. He actually did a public space on Twitter and took questions from media very briefly. It was a little bit chaotic, and there were a lot of supporters on the call who sort of dominated the time, but we actually had access to ask him questions, and that was unusual. Defendants don't usually do press when they're in the middle of their own criminal trial and haven't been sentenced yet. In fact, now that some of them have been sentenced, I expect we may hear more from them, although they will certainly be appealing their cases as well.
During this time period, you hear a lot of politicians, I won't be too specific on this, talk about how large the crowds are and how many people are demonstrating. Were there demonstrators at this court during most of these trials?
Actually, it's been quite minimal. I'm a little surprised there hasn't been more. Even when Trump was here for his arraignment, the protest crowd was pretty small. There was a lot of anticipation that it could be a large and unruly situation, but it was not. There was a trial, had nothing to do with January 6th recently, about some anti-abortion activists who blockaded a reproductive health clinic, and that drew larger protest than what I've seen for any of the January 6th cases. I saw some graffiti outside the courthouse related to the Proud Boys, anti-Proud Boys graffiti, chalk on the sidewalks. That was sort of the extent of the action. There's a few regulars who show up and will hold signs at a lot of these. Very small number, count them on one hand.
The judges, we talked a little bit about Judge Tim Kelly, who did Proud Boys, Judge Mehta, who did a lot of the Oath Keepers, and then Judge Chutkan, who will do the Trump trial if it all stays the same. Interestingly, two of those three are immigrants.
It is. And in fact, I think in at least two of Trump's other criminal trials, he has judges who are immigrants. The judges themselves have their own fascinating stories about how they end up on the bench, how they ended up in the certain aspect of law that they cover. Judge Chutkan was a defense attorney, and there aren't that many criminal defense attorneys on the bench. And in fact, although she's Obama appointed, and Donald Trump likes to point that out, you're probably better off having a criminal defense attorney be your judge and maybe not antagonize her than you are having some of these DOJ lifers who are very sympathetic to the prosecution. And I think all of them try to account for their own biases and their own history, and not to lean one way or the other. But defense attorneys have certain experiences that other lawyers don't, and bring that with them when they're on the bench. And Judge Chutkan talks very often about her experience as a defense attorney and why that matters when she's helping adjudicate Trump's rights in trial.
She was born in Jamaica, and Judge Mehta was born in India, and Tim Kelly, I think, was born in New York State. But the reason I mention that is that do you feel any difference in where they came from as the way they deal with the law?
I don't see that, honestly. I mean, Judge Chutkan, you can hear her accent, and it's very distinctive, it's the only way you'd be able to tell, really, that she's an immigrant. And I think that their approaches to the law are sort of, I think, more driven by their legal experience and their educations here, and their maybe some of their early experiences in their early life helped shape some of their worldview, but the way I see that manifest in court is really more of just how they apply the law. So
how would you describe the difference between being in Judge Tim Kelly's court and being in Judge Chutkan's court? In other words, what does Donald Trump have to be aware of when he comes into that court, if he does?
Well, I'll have to caveat that I know Chutkan less than I know Judge Kelly and Judge Mehta, because Mehta and Kelly have held such extended trials that you get to see them every day and learn their mannerisms, learn what sets them off, what they like, what they don't like, and how they interact with defendants and all that. Chutkan I've seen less of because she's had fewer January 6 cases, especially ones that have gone to trial. She's fairly no-nonsense in her courtroom. She's very upbeat in a way that I think Judge Mehta and Judge Kelly are not. She's always... she walks in the room, she's smiling, she seems very aware of the courtroom staff and is pleasant to them, and will crack some jokes here and there. And so, that's just in terms of the demeanor aspect, that's what I can say about her. I think the day after she was assigned the Trump case, I popped into her courtroom to see if she was going to say anything about it, and she had all sorts of gallows humor about how she was hoping to go on vacation in August, and that's now out the window, and joking about, one of the defense lawyers asked her, are you doing okay? You feel safe and all that? Be safe? And she said, yeah, I'm good. My sister's helping me out, and it was just sort of, but she seemed very positive about it. It seemed like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. And I still see that, and she walks around with a security detail now. I think it's just a reflection of her significance, and that, but doesn't seem to have affected her outlook.
Did they ever allow you to interview them, the judges?
It seems very rare. I know it has happened, like, for example, when Chief Judge Howell, who's no longer the Chief Judge, transitioned to Chief Judge Boasberg. I believe both of them did sort of some exit and entry interviews about their philosophy on the court and how they manage the court. They don't like to be interviewed or discuss their rulings in court because the speaking that they do should be in court and in their papers and their opinions, their written opinions. And so I think the judges are very reluctant to ever speak publicly beyond that.
So what is it like as a reporter on a day-to-day basis? What's a day like? And do you take notes? Do you have access to the transcript? And as you sit there day after day, what are you constantly thinking about your deadlines?
Mm-hmm. At this point, covering this story, this January 6th story, which is, again, so much more than the riot. It's about the Trump level, too, and the organizers and the inspirers of what happened, and the fuller effort to subvert the 2020 election. It's chaotic. There's no 2 days are the same, and as a reporter, that's a rewarding thing, that you could walk into court. And in fact, some of these completely anonymous trials that I said nobody may cover, you walk into one of those and there's an enormously important story about a particular police officer's experience, or what a defendant's testimony might have really important clues and information that you didn't know before, and you've never heard of this case until you just happen to walk in. So the smallest case to the most significant ones are actually, you never know where your major story is going to come from. Or a judge's sentence, for example, in one of those cases, they might have a commentary or analysis of what happened that becomes very newsworthy. Like when Judge Amy Berman Jackson used one of her sentences to really scold Republicans who she said were not being courageous enough to contradict the former president when he continues to claim the election was stolen. That's a very unusual area of commentary for a judge to get into, and if you didn't cover that particular case in that particular sentencing, you wouldn't have heard it. A federal judge saying something like that is kind of eye-opening, and so, day to day, you try to cover as much as you can. I find you never want to assume that any case is too small or too unimportant to invest your time in because of moments like that.
How important is a judge, and where's their power?
The judges are the sort of controllers of their own sort of little fiefdoms. Each of them has their own courtroom. They're all powerful, and they're usually treated that way. And sometimes that affects their mindset too. I think there are judges who are particularly sensitive to having their authority questioned in their own courtroom, especially, and they will sometimes respond more angrily to those kinds of challenges than to other disputes that might arise. But I think in general, they know that there are limits. Obviously, most of what they can do can be appealed, and they know that at the district level, to the appeals court or the Supreme Court. So within their courtroom, when it comes to criminal trials, they have an enormous amount of power because those are not really appealable things. They can decide sort of which jurors are qualified ultimately. They can decide the terms of the trial that will define what evidence is admissible and not admissible. And that could shape everything. What a certain piece of evidence not being allowed can change the entire government's case, can make it change defendants' willingness to even go to trial if a certain piece of evidence is not allowed. So those judges have a lot of power over getting to the verdict, and then it becomes the province of other courts.
As you said earlier, there are about 1,100 different people that have been charged in one way or the other. Has anybody beat this thing and not been convicted?
You can count it on one hand. There are a lot of, again, the rap on DC juries is they're going to just knee-jerk convict, and I don't find that to be true. I've seen a lot of nuanced verdicts where you'll find guilt on some counts and not on others, and usually for ways that are surprising, and you realize you can sort of reconstruct it after the fact as, maybe that piece of evidence or that thing we thought was so important to them, they viewed it in a different light. But I think there's been only one or two defendants that got completely acquitted, and one of them was by a judge in a bench trial, so it wasn't even by a jury. I think when it's come to jury trials, I want to say there's been maybe one defendant who was acquitted, and maybe none. I'm just drawing a blank because I think there's at least one or two that were acquitted in bench trials.
What's the difference between a bench trial and a jury trial?
A bench trial is essentially the judge makes the call. The defendants have the right to a jury trial, but if they waive that right and say, I just want the judge to decide based on the law and the facts as he or she sees them, they can do that. And a lot of January 6 cases do go that route. I think maybe the defendants feel like they have a better shot with some of these judges who might view the evidence more skeptically, or take a more nuanced view of the law around some of these specific statutes that are being charged. And so I've seen, I think of the trials that have happened, maybe half have been bench trials of the sort of 100 or so trials that have happened. The outcomes have not been that different, with the exception of those a couple cases where people have been acquitted, or at least of some or all of the charges by judges. But it's still overwhelming in terms of the ratio of the number of convictions to acquittals.
Where did you get your training?
I went to school at Boston University, and then I covered the Massachusetts state legislature for 6 or so years before I went to Politico. And I said I came to Politico as a healthcare reporter. I didn't think I'd end up in this side of journalism. I'm glad I did. But covering a state legislature, I find, is excellent training for covering Washington, because state legislatures are typically more functional than Congress, and you get used to sort of, okay, what is a functional government supposed to look like? There's plenty of corruption, there's plenty of problems, there's plenty of things that are wrong about state governments, but it's a microcosm, and a slightly more functional microcosm of D.C. that is a great training ground.
So what, if you have a trial that's going to start at 10 o'clock, when do you get to the court? And then where do you sit to do your stories, and when do you write your stories?
Great question. Well, these days, because at the courthouse you also have the criminal grand juries meeting, who may be issuing, additionally, the ones who charged, ultimately indicted Donald Trump and others. I get the courthouse as early as possible so I can check, is there a grand jury in today? Because maybe we'll be getting an indictment of, say, Donald Trump's unindicted co-conspirators in the case that he's in right now. And for months, we've been sort of trying to get there at an early hour and seeing, is there grand jury activity today? Because there might be really significant news.
Let me stop you to ask you, how close can you get to that grand jury room?
Not very close. It's become an art more than a science to cover them, because you can sort of see them walk into the building, and you can kind of tell who the grand jurors are because you've gotten to know them when you watch long enough and consistently enough to see who's a grand juror. They go to a specific room on a specific floor, which is the third floor of the courthouse, and if you see people using that room, it's probably a grand jury. And that's it. There are people who do it every day who can identify specific grand jurors with accuracy and know when, and there's several grand juries that meet. So you have to know which grand jury it is. Is it the Trump grand jury, or is it sort of the general crimes grand jury?
Can you talk to them?
No, and they're not supposed to talk to you. I mean, I guess in theory anybody can, and no one can prevent me from doing that outside the courthouse, for example. But grand jurors are specifically admonished not to talk to press, and they can get in trouble if they do. And they're reluctant to, because it can affect and taint a case. I think they're warned that pretty effectively.
Go back to the physical way you do your story. Mm-hmm. I mean, what do you write it longhand? Do you have to feed it into the digital system? And when do you do it?
When you're in a courtroom, you have to take notes by hand. That's the only way. So that's another reason why I prefer the media room when I can, because my ability to take handwritten notes has eroded over time as it's become less valuable in a non-court context. So I tend to file in the media room or just sitting there in the courthouse hallway. A lot of times the media room's not even open unless there's a major thing going on. So it's kind of all over the place. I think the court staff get annoyed sometimes because when on bigger days there's a lot of press scattered across the atrium of the courthouse, the main sort of lobby area, and I can look at them. They were frequently told that this is not your living room, but our options aren't great. You can sit in the cafeteria and do it too, but it's kind of, there's not like a very nice, neat filing center for you in the courthouse.
What kind of a grade would you give the court from the public relations standpoint? In other words, how well are you treated? Can you get access to information at that court?
I think the answer is yes. And actually, I'm very appreciative and complimentary of the court staff in D.C., and especially when I've seen how some of the especially when I've seen how some of the other federal courts have handled Donald Trump related matters, where they have completely shut down access, even when they have limited access to begin with. They've said, oh yeah, you used to be able to bring your phone into the building, but turn it off. Now you can't even bring your phone into the building. You got to leave it at your hotel or something if you're traveling from out of town. And it's just wild, the lengths they're going to prevent meaningful coverage. Or something. And I think the D.C. court has done the opposite. When Donald Trump was arraigned, when they had every reason to lock down more than they have, they actually facilitated really good access. And I think in general, sure, I'd love more of these to be televised. I'd love greater access as a principle to these proceedings. I think the D.C. court, above other courts, though, in that context, actually makes it very coverable and very accessible.
Let's go back to the average person sitting in the courtroom. What do they see? And you mentioned this early in the conversation about the tedium. What, the sidebars, the breaks, the judges showing up late. Explain all that. And what's it going to be like for a person sitting there?
I mean, I think that a lot of people have this sort of law and order idea of there's going to be these moments of high drama in the court at all times, and I think the answer is you do get those, but they're not easy to predict, and they're sort of broken up by a lot of these, as you said, sidebars, arguments over the law, disputes about things that come up. A lot of time, defense lawyers or prosecutors too will try to disrupt a meaningful argument because it's not to their in terms of with an objection or something to sort of break the flow if they feel like they're on the losing end of a particular witness's testimony. And so I think we saw that a lot in the Proud Boys trial. We mentioned Carmen Hernandez. She very rarely let a witness make a cogent and articulate point without objecting, especially if it was one that wasn't going her way. And that became very frustrating at times, but I think that could be part of a defense strategy too, to not let someone, captivate the jury in a way that they would if they were just allowed to speak freely and open-endedly about their feelings and views about various things.
What's a sidebar?
It's where the attorneys and the judge will speak on out of the earshot of the public and the jury. And a lot of time in the courtroom there's a husher, and it makes it's like a white noise machine, and it actually is quite effective. They can stay at their tables, and they'll take they have a phone, and they'll all pick up the phone and turn on the husher, and they can hear each other, but we can't hear anything they're saying. Sometimes
you see as many as 15 people with a phone in their ear.
Yep, when you have a big trial with a lot of defendants, it could be, you feel like everyone in the courtroom is having a secret conversation, but you. And we'll try to read lips if you can, and it usually doesn't work out that way. And it's usually to decide things that are not meant for the jury's ears. They don't want to have to make the jury leave the room every time they need to have a dispute about an objection that might be something the jury isn't supposed to hear, and so that's the most efficient way to do it.
So as you look back over the last couple of years and all the trials you've sat in, who are the people that you remember the most? And I'm talking about either witnesses or final statements from a defendant that's been convicted.
Sure. I think that I remember Stuart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keeper, taking the stand in his own case, and I think maybe torching his own case because of his demeanor toward the prosecution, his argument about the role of the Oath Keepers in January 6th. I think he was very brash in a way, and kind of rejected the overwhelming evidence against him in a way that was incredible to the jury.
And this is a man who has a Yale law degree.
Yes, and prosecutors like to remind the jury of that because he knew very well the laws that he was supposed to uphold, and that he apparently did not on January 6th. And when you have a very smart and educated defendant, I think prosecutors often point that out because, it's harder for them to claim ignorance of something. It's harder for them to claim I didn't understand something because they clearly have the knowledge and the background to understand it.
Who else do you remember?
I remember Jeremy Bertino. He was a member of the Proud Boys who became a cooperating government witness. He actually pleaded guilty to seditious conspiracy for his role in what happened on January 6th. And he came face to face with people who he used to consider his brothers in the Proud Boys organization for the first time in that courtroom, and had to testify in a way that may have ultimately resulted in the guilty verdicts that we saw. And he'll be sentenced at some point, and I'm very curious, what he ends up getting as a cooperator who essentially did, and maybe even was a driver of the events of January 6th in a way that others weren't, but because he cooperated and helped secure convictions of other people, he may not end up with much jail time at all.
Who else?
Now you're challenging my memory of these hundreds of cases.
How many of the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers took the stand speaking on their own behalf, or that you saw?
Two of them in the big seditious conspiracy case, Zachary Real and Dominic Pizzola. And Pizzola, actually, he was quite memorable to me because he's famous before all of this, even more so than some of his co-defendants, because he shattered the Senate window with a riot shield that he stole from an officer. And that image of him smashing the window was a famous image of January 6th well before the trial. And so seeing him explain that for the first time in a courtroom was really powerful. And he was very combative with the prosecutors. He was very, he called it a fake prosecution, fake charges, I think he said they were. I don't think the judge liked that. And when he gets sentenced, that may come back to bite him.
What's your reaction? They Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers who were not in prison in that case that was going simultaneously with the Proud Boys were dressed in coats and ties.
Mm-hmm.
They had marshals around them dressed in coats and ties.
Mm-hmm.
And then on sentencing day, or even at the omnibus when they all got
Right.
together to deal with some of the motions at the last minute, they walk in with orange jumpsuits on, and their marshals are dressed in marshals outfits instead of coats and ties. What's that impact on you when you watch it?
Well, the jury's not around anymore. That it's a reminder that these are not. It's a reminder that essentially justice is served or being served because it's they're inmates. They've been held in pretrial detention for more than 2 years in some cases, which is a whole other subplot of their case. But it is jarring to see because you want the jury to see them and not be distracted by prison uniforms. It wouldn't be fair to them for the jury to see that. But to see that these are people who essentially are being held by their government, and it's a very heavy thing, heavy power for the government to have, and a heavy thing to witness, and to see them, again, when you approach sentencing, they're begging for mercy, and there's a very different posture than the many hours of video of them on January 6th. Some of their demeanor in the courtroom when they're not in their prison uniforms, and so it's just a stark contrast.
How would you describe some of the people that are in the court audience that have nothing to do with the case or have something to do with the case? Like mothers, fathers. I don't remember many fathers,
Yeah.
but describe that, what you see.
That to me is one of the more powerful things, especially with being in the room as opposed to watching it on the screen. Enrique Tarrio's mother was there almost every day of the trial. Wives and family members, sometimes children of the defendants are there, and it is a reminder, not to caricature some of these people as much as the crime may be worthy of punishment, as much as the crime may have been a part of this horrific moment in our history. Every single person involved is a person, and they have outside lives who are destroyed, and in some cases that's their own fault, and a lot of the defendants will get up there and say, this is my fault, I did this, the pain you're feeling, that my wife and my children are feeling is my fault. And so there's not a lot of sympathy in the sense that the judge is not going to say, well, just because your family is suffering doesn't mean I'm going to go easy on you because you made the choices that you did. But it is important to remember that it's not just about the person on the stand or in the defense table. It's about all the people that are in the audience too, and that can be very heartbreaking sometimes.
There's a woman that's been to almost every session of the Proud Boys, and when one of the Proud Boys was sentenced, she was in the audience, but she turned and put her back to the judge and refused to look at the judge until the sentencing was finished, until he left the room. How often did you see something like that?
It's rare, and I think the marshals wouldn't often allow that. because there's certain rules of decorum in the courtrooms, and B, I think it's safety reasons to not allow sort of that kind of behavior in the courtroom. So the fact that she was allowed to do it is unusual. But I think, there are people who are going to be in that room who they've developed their own opinions of the judge and the proceedings. They agree with some of the defendants that these were sham proceedings, and they're going to display it however they can. That's their only window to see the judge in front of their face, and so maybe they wanted to make a symbolic protest.
Have you given any thought to writing a book?
It's a question I get asked a lot, and I feel like I would love to, except I'm so in the day-to-day now. I'm so conditioned to, when there's news, you run and you write that news as fast as you can, because it's so competitive right now, that to get in the mindset of stepping back and saying, well, what is the bigger story to tell, and what do I have to say about that others couldn't or say better than me? It's sort of, I hope, it's humbling, and I hope someday to have the answer to that, but at the moment I don't.
But in that light, do you have a gut reaction to what the big story is, having sat through all this and know it's day after day?
Yeah, I think there is an answer to that, which is that it's sort of cliche, but it's the fragility of democracy, the fragility of our institutions. The collective story of all of this is how close we got to much, much, much more dangerous territory on and before January 6th. A lot of that comes out in the trials when you see individual moments of violence or individual moments of, close brushes where lawmakers who might have if they made a wrong turn, they would have ended up in the hands of the mob. And the fact that it didn't happen is still kind of miraculous. That's the sense I get is just how close we came, and that some of the forces that drove that are still active and ongoing. And so it's an ongoing story, not one that ended on January 6th.
Kyle Cheney of Politico, follower of the D.C. District Court, and all the Jan 6 stories. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.